Commerce Secretary Wilbur and the heads of U.S. Strategic Command and NASA testified at a House hearing about satellite technology. They discussed a proposal by the Trump administration to give the Commerce Department the responsibility for managing space traffic. This is a joint hearing of the House Armed Services Subcommittees on Space and Strategic Forces. It's an hour and 20 minutes.
Verified territory from Mars Smith.
And I am too.
Good morning. I want to thank Chairman Babin and Ranking Member Barra for their interest and cooperation in organizing this joint hearing to discuss space situational awareness in a whole of government context. I also appreciate the interest expressed by members of the House Armed Services Committee and the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology more broadly, and therefore ask unanimous consent that non-subcommittee members be allowed to participate in today's hearing after all subcommittee members have had an opportunity to ask questions. Is there objection? Hearing none, so ordered. Non-subcommittee members will be recognized in the appropriate time for 5 minutes. Given that we have an excellent panel of witnesses and lots of member interest, I will ask unanimous consent to include into the record all member statements and extraneous material. Without objection, so ordered. Today we'll hear from an excellent panel of witnesses on SSA, including the Honorable Wilbur Ross, Secretary of Commerce, the Honorable Jim Bridenstine, no stranger to this room, or this subject matter, Administrator, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and another person who's no stranger to this room, General John Hyten, Commander, United States Strategic Command. I'll turn it over to you for your brief opening statements, and then we'll roll straight into questions. General Hyten, start with you.
Well, thank you, Chairman Rogers, Babin, Smith, 3 chairmen, Ranking Members Cooper, Barra, Johnson, distinguished committee members, all of you. It's an honor to be here today with Secretary Ross and Administrator Bridenstine. It's kind of difficult not to say Congressman Bridenstine. But he's on this side of the table, which is interesting. So it's always a privilege to be here, and it's a privilege to represent the 162,000 Americans that accomplish the missions of my command every day. So I'd like to thank both committees for your enduring support to our nation's defense, and particularly for your work on our national space policy. My command, U.S. Strategic Command, is a global warfighting command. We set the conditions across the globe as the ultimate guarantor of our national and allied security, and our missions are to deter strategic attack and employ nuclear, space, global strike, joint electronic warfare, and missile defense forces as directed. To do this, we rely on timely and accurate information about the operational environments we operate in. Space is one of those environments, and it's no different than any other. Space situational awareness is how we bring together the multi-source data needed for space control and to assess adversary intentions. Our national security mission demands that we make the space environment as safe as possible to operate in, and that has led to our current sharing arrangements. Today, we take our space situational awareness data and make it available for space safety, but that's not an inherent mission of Strategic Command or the Department of Defense. And I have never believed the Department of Defense should have to perform that space traffic management for the world. We do that because we need to do it. So for a while now, I've advocated to move space traffic management to another agency while retaining the Department of Defense, in the Department of Defense, the essential elements of space situational awareness needed for our national security. So I believe transition is a good idea, and I support the actions taken by the President on Monday to designate the Department of Commerce as that lead. It's the right move, and I commit to work with the administration, the Department of Congress, and the Department of Commerce and Congress to meet the President's space traffic management goals. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to be here. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. Chair, I recognize Administrator Bridenstine.
Chairman Cooper, Chairman Smith, Chairman Babin, Ranking Member Cooper, and Chairman Rogers, I should say, Ranking Member Cooper, and Ranking Member Barra. It's great to be back. Thank you so much for having me here. It's an honor to represent NASA here before the Strategic Forces Subcommittee and the Space Subcommittee here in the House of Representatives. NASA has, of course, very important equities when it comes to space situational awareness and space traffic management. Of course, We have a human spaceflight program, and we have dozens of satellites that are delivering critically important science for our nation and, in fact, for the entire world. So we have a big stake in making sure we get right space situational awareness and space traffic management. For objects that are big enough to track, of course, we don't do the tracking ourselves and we don't keep a catalog ourselves. We rely on the strategic command for that through the JSPOC. But the data that we receive from the JSPOC, we analyze very closely to make sure that our human spaceflight activities and our robotic spaceflight activities are protected and that they remain safe. So this is critical for us. Objects that are too small to track, NASA has a department, the Orbital Debris Program Office, that is responsible for characterizing that orbital debris. And we characterize it specifically so that we can model, ultimately, the risk from these very small pieces of debris that are not trackable. And I will be clear, the biggest risk is from objects that are not trackable. That's the biggest part of what we deal with every day when it comes to protecting our assets in space. And so we characterize, where those debris fields are and ultimately how they could impact our missions and make assessments, how much do we need to invest to shield our assets and or maybe operate in different orbital regimes. So this is important to NASA. I look forward to working with this committee. I look forward to following the implementing, I should say, Space Policy Directive 2 and Space Policy Directive 3 from the President that gives these new activities to the Department of Commerce. So with that, I look forward to working with everybody here, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mr. Bridenstine. Secretary Ross, you're recognized.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Rogers, Chairman Babin, Ranking Members Cooper and Bera, and both subcommittees for allowing me to address you today. I would also like to thank Chairman Lamar Smith, Chairman Thornberry, and Ranking Members Johnson and Smith for your work on this important issue. Your continued support of this administration's space policy vision is greatly appreciated. In addition, I thank my esteemed colleagues, General Hyten and Administrator Bridenstine, for joining me on this panel. It's a pleasure to work with all of you, decision makers, leaders, and enablers of U.S. space, commercial, and defense policy. Your work is imperative to the future achievement and well-being of the United States. The Trump administration and the Department of Commerce are creating more opportunities for the space community to develop and thrive. In just 6 months, President Trump has signed 3 presidential space directives. The first calls for human expansion across the solar system. It's about time. The second sets a schedule for streamlining regulations to unshackle commercial activity in space. Commerce is already advancing ambitious regulatory reform. Over the last year, we have worked with Department of Defense, State, Department of Interior, and the Director of National Intelligence to reduce commercial remote sensing application timelines by about 50% from where they were before. We've cut what was 210 days down to an average of 91 days. The President's third Space Policy Directive, signed at this week's Space Council meeting, establishes the country's first comprehensive national space traffic management policy. The directive emphasizes safety, stability, and sustainability, foundational elements to successful space activities. And it names commerce as the new U.S. government interface for space traffic coordination. This new policy directs the department to provide a basic level of space situational awareness data for public and non-public use based on the space catalog compiled by the Department of Defense. This change will better enable DoD to focus on its national security mission. Commerce is eager to provide that service to industry to facilitate continued commercial development in outer space. As the friend of business agency and not a typical old-fashioned regulator, we are the perfect agency for the job. Unlike in past generations, activity in space is becoming largely commercial. Commerce already engages with private space companies on export control, spectrum issues, remote sensing licensing, and trade promotion. And we already manage, with NASA's great support, the government's largest operational civil satellite fleet, 14 NOAA satellites and 4 for the Air Force. We also have the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which has a proven track record of working with industry to conduct research and to define scientific standards for business needs. We're looking forward to taking on this new role of space traffic coordination. The need for timely and accurate and actionable SSA data and STM services has never been greater. DoD currently observes well over 20,000 objects circling the Earth, many of which are softball-sized or larger pieces of man-made space debris. These objects fly around Earth at dangerous speeds of up to 17,500 miles per hour, about 10 times the speed of a small bullet. Even more concerning are the estimated 600,000 smaller objects that could still cause significant harm if a collision occurred. Congestion in space will only increase. In the next few years, the number of American satellites in space will likely grow from 800 to over 15,000. As more and more objects get launched, effective space traffic coordination and orbital degree mitigation standards will help promote our Earth's orbits from further congestion. With the growth of space commerce and DoD's focus on national security, President Trump and the National Space Council determined that commerce should become the new civil agency interface. With this role, commerce can incentivize innovative space services based on an open architecture data repository. This repository will establish a mechanism for SSA data sharing that will enable enhanced STM services, that will empower greater industry-provided data and services. Involvement by industry, academia, and other stakeholders is paramount to the success of this endeavor, and it will take a whole-of-government approach to face this challenge. Working with NASA and DoD, Commerce is committed to facilitating these discussions and implementing their results so that the United States can provide global leadership for space traffic standards. America must continue to be the leader in space. Space traffic coordination is an important task, and Commerce has dedicated serious deliberation and planning in its execution. We have an excellent relationship with our partners, and we will continue working with them to carry out the implementation plan approved by the National Space Council. The administration is setting clear milestones and will be transparent about achieving them. Commerce takes on this new responsibility with several goals in mind. We will be dedicated to creating economic growth and sustainable development in all industry sectors. Facilitating space traffic coordination will provide the space industry with more tools to be successful. Commerce will also work with industry to find ways to enhance space traffic coordination data and be more adaptive to industry concerns. Working with DoD, we will evolve the architecture that currently supports U.S. Strategic Command to be even more responsive to the space industry's needs. And we look forward to working with Congress to protect a safe space environment for future commercial growth. With Commerce at the helm of commercial space traffic coordination, we will ensure that the growing space industry remains open for business, and America will continue to be the flag of choice for space commerce. I'll be happy to respond to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank all the witnesses for being here and for those thoughtful opening statements and for what you do for our country. I recognize myself for the first set of questions. General Hyten, I fully support the President's directive on space management policy, but I do want to make sure that I'm clear on this, and I think you touched on it in your opening statement. Given that space is clearly now recognized as a warfighting domain, are you saying that you don't believe that there are this unique DoD SSA requirements can only be met by the military, that you believe that they can be effectively met by non-military efforts?
So I really need to be specific on that, because we have to do the space situational awareness mission inside Strategic Command, inside the Department of Defense, for the missions that we have to do for national security space.
And that will continue?
That will not change. That will not change for as far as I can see into the future, because we have to know that information in order to defend ourselves against potential threats. That's why we started doing this business back in the Cold War days to begin with. So we're going to continue that, but we don't have to be the public face to the world for, that's what the new decision is, to have the Department of Commerce be the public face of the world.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to make clear, and I appreciate that. Mr. Secretary, you're right about the activity up there. In addition to this roughly 620,000 pieces of debris that you and the administrator have talked about, we have a lot of activity going up and going to continue to be that way. You talked about 600 or so, 600 to 800 satellites now and going toward 15,000. I know of Boeing and SpaceX in this country that are each talking about putting constellations up for broadband capability. It can be as many as 2,000 or 3,000 satellites each, these small sats. And I know there's at least one Indian company that's doing the same thing, a couple thousand. That's just going to proliferate. And I've been very concerned about how we're going to manage that. Tell me exactly how you see this working as far as that traffic management and, more importantly, the debris mitigation that you made reference to. And I'd open that up for either one of the two of you.
Well, we already are dealing a lot with some of these issues through NOAA because of its satellites. So we have people already somewhat familiar with this sector. We have planned to send initial delegations out to Vandenberg, out to Omaha, to start learning more about the specifics that would be involved. And we're prepared to dedicate people to that and have people from those entities also working at Commerce so that we make a seamless integration. Hard to predict exactly what the timeline would be, but it's probably something more or less on the order of a year to make a seamless transition between the two.
Do you anticipate a cooperation with countries like China and the companies therein and companies in India that are going to also be concerned about this activity?
Well, yes. We, as you know, have a very international map to both our activities and our physical presence. And parts of our activity, such as the ITA, the promotion entity that has created some $3 billion of space business already. NIST works with just about every country in the world in evolving standards, and getting them agreed with other countries is clearly a very important part of this activity.
Mr. Bridenstine, how would debris mitigation work functionally? I don't know. I don't have a clue.
So a couple of things. You mentioned earlier, Chairman Rogers, that there were going to be these constellations of potentially thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit for the purpose of communications. That's absolutely true. Where NASA is right now, we participate in what's called the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee. When this committee hears the word interagency, you think of within the U.S. government. When we talk about the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, we're talking about space agencies from around the world. And this interagency committee includes 13 different space agencies across the world. And what this organization has determined is that every 5 to 9 years, if launch cadences stay the same and the orbital debris fields stay the same, every 5 to 9 years, we're going to have a collision in low Earth orbit similar to the Iridium-Cosmos collision that we saw back in 2009 that created thousands of pieces of orbital debris. Now, that's if launch cadences stay the same and constellations don't grow. In fact, we're seeing just the opposite. Launch is going to be happening a whole lot more frequently, especially if I'm successful doing my job as the NASA administrator. We're going to see a lot more launches. We're going to see a lot more activity in low Earth orbit. So these kind of collisions beget even more collisions. So we have to be very careful that we don't let this eventually run away. And I'm not saying that we're even close to that right now, but we need to be thinking the next 50 years, 100 years down the road, especially as we take more advantage of space. As far as how NASA deals with a lot of the, you mentioned the word mitigation challenges, NASA sets standards to prevent new orbital debris from occurring. So when a spacecraft gets launched and then it separates from its upper stage, sometimes that can result in debris. And so we set standards for ourselves as an agency to limit that kind of activity so that we prevent or we limit as much as possible the danger from space debris. Those standards then ultimately get promulgated throughout the rest of the interagency within the U.S. government. So the Department of Defense follows those standards, NOAA follows those standards, other agencies that utilize space, and eventually it got to the point where now those standards are required for commercial operations as well, and of course promulgated throughout the international community. So NASA has led on this. I will be clear that not all the countries follow the same standards, and so that is often a challenge. But I do believe it's important for us to lead and that those standards could eventually get to a point where there's enough international pressure that around the world countries will have to follow those standards.
Great. Thank you very much. Chair, and I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cooper, for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, would like to welcome the witnesses. I appreciate Mr. Bridenstine's chart here. I think that's very helpful in helping us understand the debris problem. I'm worried, though, that the chart underestimates the difficulty. As you point out in your testimony, and Secretary Ross does as well, we have some 600,000 pieces of very tiny debris to monitor because each one of those pieces could be deadly.
That's right.
And as all the witnesses said, this problem is only increasing, and it's probably increasing exponentially. So right now, as we're offloading the priceless work the Air Force has been doing for space traffic management, right now we're reaching the acute phase, the urgent phase for the entire planet, when, as Secretary Ross pointed out, a large percentage of today's space debris is the result of just 2 collisions, just 2. And now there are going to be thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of collision possibilities. And as the Secretary also pointed out in his testimony, each one of these could lead to a devastating chain reaction of creating yet further debris, which could tax the power of even the fastest supercomputer to monitor all these orbits and trajectories and speeds and things like that. So, simple question. Should we punish nations or companies that cause satellite debris? It's one thing to use carrots. Are we also going to consider sticks? To each of the witnesses.
Ranking Member Cooper, within the Outer Space Treaty, nations are responsible for what they do in space. There is a liability that nations have for these kind of activities. Unfortunately, if you look throughout history, some very nefarious activities have happened in space. We talk about, on your subcommittee, we talk about the 2007 direct ascent anti-satellite missile launched by China that hit one of their own weather satellites and created an orbital debris field of thousands of pieces that we are, in fact, still dealing with today in low Earth orbit. The challenge that we have is enforcement at the international level. It's a big challenge. So certainly we have seen activities change based on international pressure, but we haven't seen really any enforcement as far as liability, anybody paying the price for the damage that they've done to low Earth orbit.
Let's make it a U.S.-only issue. Should we punish a U.S. company that causes needless space debris?
That's a good question, sir. I'd like to take that for the record and maybe get back to you on what a good approach on that might be. But certainly, and I think you're aware of this keenly, we want to maximize the utility of space. We want commercial companies to have access and availability. And if they are not, in fact, following the rules, we could deny access to space for everybody altogether, which would undermine our ability to maximize the utility of space. So there should be some kind of legal regime. Yes, sir.
My time is limited with all the other members here, but there's the attribution problem. NASA currently has a statistical model to track these 600,000 pieces. How do you tell a satellite company, or worse, an astronaut, that they died or were killed because of a statistic? People will want attribution. If you have enough data to form the model, then there must be some reasonable source for that data. So we've got to figure this out, because the 600,000 pieces you're tracking today could be tens of millions or billions shortly.
Yes, sir. Attribution is critical, and some of the new technologies that are being developed right now could help us to attribute, a piece of orbital debris that caused somebody's loss of life to a specific nation or company. That's a challenge going forward for sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Chairman Babin for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, witnesses, for being here, too. Secretary Ross, I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind. I'd like to start by stating my support for the President's Space Policy Directive 3. And while I'm at it, I support 1 and 2 as well. In Congress, we have a responsibility to protect the taxpayer. Government spending and bureaucracy is a serious concern. However, not improving the nation's civil space situational awareness and space traffic management framework is unacceptable. What steps will be taken to protect against unnecessary spending, and how much funding will be needed to carry this policy out?
Well, thank you for that question, sir. This activity will report to the Regulatory Reform Officer at Commerce. And as you may be aware, we have already dismantled 65 regulations, which is more than any other cabinet department. So we're keenly aware of the importance of reducing a bureaucratic burden, both in terms of direct taxpayer expense and in terms of the burden unnecessarily placed on industry. So that will be one of the activities we have very, very much in mind.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question for Administrator Bridenstine. NASA has substantial technical expertise relevant to improving space situational awareness and space traffic management. For example, Johnson Space Center is home to the world-renowned orbital debris scientists. Under SD3, how will NASA leverage its expertise to further our national SSA and STM efforts?
It's a wonderful question, Chairman. So under Space Policy Directive 3 and the implementation guidance, NASA is directed to lead a research and technology effort that takes advantages of the capabilities that we already have, but also make investments to improve on those capabilities and technologies. I think our biggest area of focus historically has been investing in characterizing, the orbital debris population that cannot be tracked because it's too small, and then assessing risk based on that orbital debris population. And of course, Space Policy Directive 3 is going to take it a step further and give us authorities to ultimately make investments to do space situational awareness, or potentially creating an environment, kind of the way I see NASA being involved. I'll just start over here a little bit. Kind of like the way NASA does unmanned aerial systems traffic management. We don't want to be involved in doing unmanned aerial systems traffic management for the United States of America and integrating UAVs into the airspace. That's not the job of NASA. But what we can do is we can do the technology demonstrations, we can do pilot programs, we can do the research, and then ultimately take all of what we learn and hand it over to the FAA, which is the way NASA is dealing with UTM, unmanned aerial systems traffic management, right now. I think going forward under Space Policy Directive 3, we're going to be charged with the same thing, maybe doing pilot programs, demonstrating technology, and then ultimately handing it over to Commerce, which will have the lead on space situational awareness and space traffic management in the future. It is also true that NASA will not be creating data. That's ultimately not what we do. Of course, the Air Force, or I should say Strategic Command, creates data through the JSPOC, and then that data could be provided to Commerce. It could also be provided to commercial partners, and then the data that Commerce has would be augmented, probably also with commercial partners. And what NASA can do is ultimately test a lot of the technologies, test the data, and then ultimately implement a plan to help Commerce lead the effort.
Great. Okay, thank you. And then General Hyten, the DOD, and in particular the Air Force, has proposed a significant increase in their space capabilities with the FY19 budget. Would you talk a little bit about these capabilities that this increased investment will provide and how they will enable your, enhance your warfighting mission?
So, Mr. Chairman, I'm a combatant commander, so the question, the specific answer can come from the Air Force. But as a combatant commander, I do advocate for those capabilities, and I'm very aware of what the Air Force has put in the budget, and I'm pleased with the improvements the Air Force has made in the budget, because those improvements come in a number of different ways. For the purpose of this hearing, a lot of those improvements are in space situational awareness. The Air Force now has a joint program with the National Reconnaissance Office called Silent Barker, where instead of having two programs on two different sides of the national security space business, there'll be one. That one program will improve our situational awareness at geosynchronous orbit in a significant way. We're also producing the Space Fence. The Space Fence will come online in 2019. That capability will allow us to see hundreds of thousands of objects that we don't see today. That data will be critical to our mission in the Department of Defense, but we can also provide that to the Department of Commerce and NASA to allow this broader piece to happen. And then broadly speaking, what you see in the budget is an improvement of our ability to defend ourselves against threats in space. What you see is a change of our architectures from a large status quo structured approach to a more resilient, survivable capability that can defend ourselves in the future. And then you see in the classified world a lot of work being put to make sure we have the ability to defend ourselves if we're attacked.
And then right along those same lines, how will the establishment of a civil SSA program at the Department of Commerce benefit DOD and continue to protect national interests?
So we talked about the Iridium Cosmos collisions in 2009. I was the investigating officer of that collision. And one of the things we realized, General Chilton was the commander of Strategic Command at the time, and when I briefed him, we kind of came to the realization that we're going to have to do this flight safety mission ourselves. And we had to take about 100 airmen, 100 military people off of other missions and put them on that in order to do that mission. Now, we've become a little more efficient as we've gone through the years because we've been able to improve our automation and capabilities, but we still have dozens and dozens of airmen and do that all the time. When we move that now into the Department of Commerce, we still have to do the job for ourselves, but we'll be able to free up those airmen to focus on the warfighting missions that we need to worry about. That's what we get out of this new approach.
Yes, sir. And then finally, Secretary Ross, Space Directive number 3 states that basic space situational awareness and space traffic management services should be provided free of direct user fees. And just to clear up some concern and questions, what services are considered basic, and what are some examples of services that go beyond basic?
Well, thank you. We can use the same definition of basic services as has been used historically. We don't see any reason to change that. But a major function will be an open architecture approach to it. Commerce is directed to build that under SPD 3 to incorporate DoD, NASA information with information from international partners and commercial operated data. So it will be a two-directional set of communications, and that will create an enhanced space situational awareness picture.
And then how about the basic, what would be considered beyond basic?
Well, the idea of open architecture, right now, there is not an open architecture. It's a one-way communication channel. We think there is merit to having inputs with information from international partners, as we do right now with the National Weather Service. We coordinate with lots and lots of other government entities in other parts of the world. And that's a very important part of our activity.
Okay, thank you, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair, I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Bear, for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And obviously, this is an incredibly timely hearing. Before I ask my questions, I also just want to be clear that we've not made a decision, this body, Congress, as to where space situational awareness should be housed. So, that is not an administrative decision. That is a congressional decision. And Secretary Ross, with all due respect, I don't want the Department of Commerce to start making those plans, because, as has already been raised in each of the testimony, this is incredibly important as we go forward. I think it is important for, under the leadership of both chairmen of HASC as well as of Science, Space, and Technology. I know Chairman Smith, Chairman Babin, the ranking member Johnson, we've been talking about this quite a bit, and we've got to get this right. It's better to get it right because this is the 21st century. We have to make sure that DoD has everything that it needs to continue to do the important work of protecting our vital assets in space. And, as Administrator Bridenstine has already pointed out, we don't want to stifle the innovation in the commercial sector. We don't want to stifle the interest in the international community, but we want to do this right, and we do need that, for lack of a better way of describing it, air traffic control cop that is going to, put everyone in the right lane and, to the best of our abilities, prevent accidents from happening in space. It really does have the possibility of transforming what the 21st century looks like. So, again, this Congress, as a deliberative body that has oversight over, what situational awareness looks like in the 21st century, I appreciate the interest of the President and the Vice President, the Space Council, and your interest, Secretary Ross, but we've got to do our work, and we're not abdicating that responsibility. Secretary Ross, if we are looking at housing situational awareness within Department of Commerce, there's a lot that has to go into this transition. What kind of resources are necessary? What kind of oversight? How do you share information that only the Department of Defense is probably going to be able to see? How do you make that publicly available? How do you make that internationally available? I'd ask, are you prepared through your department to present an implementation and transition plan to Congress and to this body?
Well, we certainly would if and when we're authorized to undertake the function. But we already, as I mentioned, we disseminate to the public about 40% of all the factual information emitted by the administration. So we're very used to packaging information, getting it to the right place, getting it in the right format for people to use. And one example is space weather is, as you know, a very major factor in this whole situation because of the impact it has on things that are orbiting around. Well, we're already keenly involved with space weather through our space satellites that are part of the National Weather Service. So we're already into that aspect of it and in a very good position, for example, to integrate that with these other activities.
Well, great. And as my colleague from Colorado, who is helping us push a space weather bill through Congress, it might sound really geeky or wonky, but incredibly important since all of the technology that we rely on, GPS technology, et cetera, not just our military, but everyday consumers and individuals. General Hyten, we've put a lot of responsibility on the DOD and the Air Force, and you've done the DOD's done a wonderful job kind of monitoring, and it is time that, we relieve you of some of that burden for the international world and the commercial sector. From my perspective, as we go through this transition, there still are going to be unique capabilities that only the DOD has and only the DOD should have. We'll have to think through how that information gets passed on to NASA or to Commerce or Department of Transportation. And as you're thinking through this, do you have any thoughts of what we should be thinking about as a deliberative body?
So a couple of thoughts. So I think from the largest perspective, we have to make sure that as we go forward in the future, we always have the ability to make sure we understand what our adversaries are doing. That means we have to have exquisite situational awareness of exactly what is happening on a real-time basis. That's why you have authorized significant amounts of taxpayer dollars to be put against this problem. As we go into this different sharing arrangement, though, I think the first rule that comes to mind is the first rule of wing walking, and that is you don't let go of the strut until you have good hold of the next strut, which means we can't let loose of what we have now and what we're doing until we know what is on the other side. SPD 3 says for the future, the Department of Defense is responsible for providing the authoritative catalog for our country. That means the catalog will come out of the Department of Defense. Now we have to push that into the Department of Commerce, into NASA, into other places. We're going to look with open eyes at how we do that, what the way is that we do that. Are there better ways to do that? I think you'll see things as we go through the coming year of different ways to do it. But again, don't let go of the one strut until you get hold of the next one.
Well, and I'd share that sentiment. Let's hold on to that strut. Let's think in a deliberative fashion what this looks like, think through all the different scenarios, and then come up with the right decision. Better to be deliberative about this and get it right as opposed to be hasty about this. Administrator Bridenstine and Jim, it's good to see you on that side of the podium. I know we share a mutual interest in allowing the commercial sector and recognizing the importance of space, but I think we also share a value, and I think all of us in this room share this value that the world is best served with American leadership, and that translates to space as well. And I do think in how we look at the world, NASA is going to be critically important as we address this framework, because it's not just a domestic issue. This is an international issue, and let's get this framework right and then take it to the international community so it does set that framework. Do you have any thoughts of what we should be thinking about?
Absolutely, Ranking Member Bera, and it is good to be here. Thank you for that. And this goes really to the heart of what Chairman Babin was talking about with what is basic space situational awareness data? What is that? Because it's very clear in SPD 3 and the implementation guidance that needs to be without fee. And the question is why? And as you mentioned, American leadership here matters. So we need to have, in my view, some basic SSA data available for free, because then when people all around the world are making investments, making determinations where they're going to invest their money to do space activities, they're going to make that determination in the United States of America, because we will have a regime that provides safety and security for their investments and at the same time is without fee. So that attracts capital to the United States. It keeps us in a preeminent position. Now, there will be debate about the fact that some people would like to see commercial companies, and this would be a good thing, and I support it. Some people would like to see commercial companies providing the space situational awareness and space traffic management. We could have a regime where maybe Commerce were to license commercial companies to do that activity, and then before you launch, you have to prove to Commerce that you have purchased or bought a subscription to one of those commercial companies providing SSA and STM. So that's a model where you would have a competitive market to provide more data and better data with multiple STA, STM providers, all licensed by Commerce. But at the same time, we get back to what is that basic STA, STM that would be provided without fee. And this is going to be a balance, because ultimately we want people to make investments in the United States of America, and at the same time we want a commercial competitive marketplace where these providers of STA and SSA and STM, they're competing to provide more data and better data at a lower cost, driving down insurance rates, all those kind of things. So this is not going to be an easy thing, as you've already identified, but here's what I think all of us believe: it has to be done, because what's at stake is so important right now.
Great. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Baird. Chair, and I recognize Chairman Lamar Smith for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me say that it is gratifying to see the cooperation and collaboration between the two committees that has resulted in this hearing today. This may be a first. It's certainly the first in many years, and I hope it'll be an example of further cooperation between our committees. Second of all, it's nice to see a former member of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee as the new administrator of NASA. Jim Bridenstine is the right person at the right time in the right place, and that doesn't happen that often, but it's nice that it happened here. And so,
thank you, sir.
Jim, good to be with you. Secretary Ross, let me direct my first question to you, and I think this will help a number of members here. Would you go into some detail as to why you think the Department of Commerce is the best agency to oversee the space traffic management?
Yes, sir. First of all, as you know, we have elevated all of these space activities within Commerce into the Office of Space Commerce, which reports directly to me. So rather than being fragmented, rather than being buried in different parts of the department, we're pulling it all together. That in and of itself will make it more functional, less bureaucratic than it had been. In terms of specific things that we can do, the ITA has the statutory duty, as does the Office of Space Commerce, to promote and assist this burgeoning space industry. The National Institute for Standards and Technology, which has a very proven record in developing standards and having them adopted throughout global economies, will be very, very involved. NTIA, which manages federal spectrum use for space communications, will also play a very important role in it. And then NOAA, as you know, it already oversees the largest operational space force in the private civil sector. So those are some of the experiences that we already have. Okay. Notwithstanding, we continue to engage with our partners at the Department of Transportation on a variety of issues, and we will be working quite intensely with NASA on the one hand and with DOD on the other hand. So we already are planning within the next couple of weeks to send, as I mentioned, delegation to Omaha and to Vandenberg.
Okay.
So we're trying very hard to figure out the proper way to integrate ourselves.
Okay.
The other thing that you should be aware, many companies that don't need a license actually put a camera on their payload anyway to get the license for remote sensing from Commerce. And the reason they do that is it deals with their compliance with the Outer Space Treaty. So here you have companies volunteering to come under the regulatory regime of the Department of Commerce. And I think that speaks volumes about the degree to which the industry feels we and they can work in very good unison together.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Administrator Bridenstine, the NASA has had a long and strong relationship with the Department of Defense that you've mentioned, and should the Department of Commerce take over the space traffic management, is your relationship with DOD going to change one way or the other? And also, what would be NASA's role in dealing with the Department of Commerce on some of the issues that you've been dealing with the Department of Defense?
That's a wonderful question. So even right now, NASA has folks at the JSPOC that are looking out for the interests of NASA with all the great data and tools that are available inside the JSPOC. So that's happening right now. And if there is a NASA asset that could be at risk because of an object that's being tracked at the JSPOC, those orbital safety analysts ultimately take that data and they get in touch with one of two people. They go straight to Johnson, where they report it to the trajectory operations officer. We call it the TOPO. At Johnson Space Center. And then they do further analysis to determine if that object could ultimately put the International Space Station at risk. That's what they're specifically looking for. And then if it does, what do we do about it? So that's on one hand. On the other hand, some of the data goes to CARA, which is over at Goddard for the robotic capabilities. But I guess my point is, to your question, the answer is yes. We have a great working relationship with the Department of Defense. We have our NASA personnel working side by side with their folks at the JSPOC, feeding data to our centers to make sure that our assets are protected. And I anticipate that will continue. As General Hyten has said, when we move to a day where commerce is at the helm of space situational awareness and traffic management, it is absolutely true that the Department of Defense will continue to keep the catalog because they need to for their own purposes. So it is possible that NASA would continue to have our personnel maybe at the JSPOC. No decision has been made. Maybe we could take the data from the DOD and combine it with commercial data over at Commerce and international data over at Commerce and ultimately get a better integrated space picture at a different agency. Not that that would necessarily happen, but it could. And if it did happen, then we would want our folks over at Commerce, and we'd probably keep them at DOD as well. But again, this is way early and undetermined at this point.
Okay, thank you, Administrator Bridenstine. And General Hyten, let me ask my last question to you. And it's just been mentioned both by the Administrator and by Congressman Bear a few minutes ago in regard to the catalog of space objects that users take advantage of to avoid collisions in space. If the Department of Commerce takes over that responsibility and others that are now assumed by the Department of Defense, do you see any diminution in the quality of product, any diminution in the quality of service if the Department of Commerce takes over some of those responsibilities?
So, Mr. Chairman, I think that the line in the Space Policy Directive 3 that says the Department of Defense has to maintain the authoritative catalog. The reason that is there is because you can't have arguing catalogs. You can't have one in the Department of Commerce and one in the Department of Defense, and then you end up arguing. We actually You used to have that inside the Department of Defense because we had one that was done by the Navy, one that was done by the Air Force, and it's not healthy to be arguing over which one is better. You have to take the best data, build that catalog, and that's why I said the authoritative catalog will always be in the Department of Defense. Then we'll feed that data into the Department of Commerce, and they can take other pieces to do the interface with other nations, with the commercial sector, possibly with NASA. I would envision what Congressman Administrator Bridenstine said as the, I would see at the JSPOC at Vandenberg, soon to be the Coalition Space Operations Center. We'll have international partners, NASA, Commerce there, and then we'll feed information out of there into Commerce, into NASA. I think that's the healthy way, but like Secretary Ross said, we're still in the early days of figuring this out.
Still, that clarification that you just mentioned, I think, is very reassuring to us, and it portends a wonderful relationship between DOD and the Department of Commerce. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair, and I recognize Ranking Member Johnson for any questions she may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. Let me welcome our witnesses and thank you for your service. General, the Obama administration had considered agency roles and responsibilities for the civil SSA data and information services and had reached an interagency agreement that FAA assumed that role. I understand that FAA, in coordination with DOD, was planning to do a pilot program at FAA on the civil SSA data and information services. What would that pilot program have entailed, and what are your thoughts on a pilot program as part of the transition of SSA data sharing to the civil agency?
So thank you for the question, because it's important that we kind of go back in history a little bit to look at that. Because I've been working in this world for over 2 decades. 1998, I transitioned a weather mission out of the Air Force into the Department of Commerce. For the last 10 years, really since the Iridium Cosmos collision in 2009, I've been working very hard in the interagency to try to figure out where to put that mission, because it's not inherently a DoD mission. And so in the last administration, we were working with Commerce and Transportation. The FAA was going to do a pilot program. That pilot program was going to basically look at what it would take for us to ship the catalog into that organization, and for them, what kind of analysis tools, what kind of pieces would they have in order to do that information. As we've transitioned this administration, and the new SPD3 that just came out says Commerce is going to take the lead on that based on the burgeoning commercial sector. From the STRATCOM perspective, from the DoD perspective, bluntly, it doesn't matter to me. We need a civil agency that is doing that role. Commerce makes sense, transportation makes sense. That's a political decision. I think that Secretary Ross has made a good argument today of why Commerce is properly situated to do that. I will work with whatever element that our nation decides is the right place to do it, and SPD3 makes it clear that Commerce right now is the lead. So in the next few weeks, we'll be working closely with Commerce. If that changes, I will work with whoever it takes.
Thank you very much. Any other comments from other panel members?
Yeah, can you repeat the question one more time?
The question that I had posed is about the pilot program that had started with the FAA being the lead, and if that had been any information that's transferable or...
So I think some of the arguments are that especially commercial industry would like a one-stop shop. And one of the challenges we have right now is that from my perspective, it looks very difficult to find a one-stop shop, because you've got the FCC that's responsible for spectrum, you've got NOAA that's responsible for remote sensing and imaging and that kind of regulation, you've got the FAA that's responsible for launch and reentry, and of course NASA is responsible for giving advice on protecting the space environment when it comes to orbital debris, and even preventing harmful contamination of planets and things like that. So there are a whole host of different agencies involved in space at different levels. So the question then becomes, how do you create a one-stop shop? And it looks increasingly more and more difficult all the time. So how do we minimize? This is the key, I think, Ranking Member Johnson, that we all have to recognize. How do we create the maximum regulatory certainty with the minimal regulatory burden? And if we can consolidate these activities in one federal agency or another, that minimizes the regulatory burden for the commercial operators especially. So Secretary of Commerce has, I think, very clearly articulated that they believe they have the capability. The President's Space Policy Directive 3 says that they want Commerce to lead that activity. And I think that's a great idea. In fact, I voted on the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act and supported it in the subcommittee and the full committee when I was on the other side of the aisle here. So I think the key is it needs to be done. I think Commerce is a good place to do it.
Thank you. Did you have any comment, Mr. Ross?
Yes. Well, a couple of things. Commerce already has many space industry-facing resources. By statute, we are obliged to foster growth in the space commerce industry through the Office of Space Commerce. Second, we license satellites' remote sensing activities through the Commercial Remote Sensing Regulatory Affairs Office. Third, we manage federal spectrum through the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Fourth, we manage space weather data collection and distribution through NOAA. Fifth, we enforce the Export Administration regulations as they apply to space objects through the Bureau of Industry and Security. Sixth, we promote U.S. space industry abroad through the International Trade Administration. And finally, once the payload is separated from the rocket, it's usually a different owner. The launch system is very different, and it's usually a different entity from the one who has the payload. So there is no continuity between launch and what goes on once the payload is in outer space. That payload is, often as not, comes under our orbit in any event. I hope that explains why we think we're quite logical.
Yes, yes, sir. What agencies now within federal government that currently carries out the research on SSA and the orbital debris, and to what extent are those activities coordinated?
Ranking Member Johnson, NASA, of course, does a lot of the research and the technology. We really kind of set the standards that ultimately get followed by the other agencies. So NASA is very involved in it. We partner with universities and with commercial industry to come up with the best practices and the technology and the research. And so when it comes to the S&T piece of it, NASA really takes the lead.
And Ranking Member Johnson, we have a lot of capability in the Department of Defense to look at that, but I would agree with Administrator Bridenstine. NASA is the lead when it comes to the S&T into that. We take most of their algorithms and incorporate into what we do. We have to be able to characterize that, which is why we still do research in that area, but NASA is clearly the lead.
Thank you very much. Just one final question. How could this work be leveraged in a civil operational SSA system?
So ultimately, the idea behind SSA and STM, if we want to be as safe as possible, we need more data, and we need better data, more accurate data, and we need the ability to process that data. And so when it comes to science and technology, which is what NASA does, those are investments that we make. We want to be able to get more data, better data, and be able to process it in a way that ultimately gives us a much more safe environment, and then take that and hand it to the agencies that actually do SSA and STM.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lambert, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all the chairmen for putting together this great hearing, and thank you for the panelists for what you're doing for our country. And I've got one question for each one of you. General Hyten, a lot of the data standards work for space situational awareness is done in Colorado Springs at Air Force Space Command. So how will this policy affect that tremendously important work?
So the work that we need in order to characterize threats will continue. It'll continue through STRATCOM, through my Joint Force Space Component Commander, who is also the Air Force Space Command Commander in Colorado. He has the people that do that work. That work will continue. It has to continue. But I think what will change as we look into the future, and this is just a natural progression as we look in the domain, is that we will have to partner closer with not only NASA and the Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation, but the commercial sector as well, because there's a number of significant commercial entities that actually do this mission. And they have capabilities that we need to be able to leverage as well. So it can't be that one size fits all. We have to take the best of breed from wherever it comes and integrate that to provide the best capabilities we can. The interesting thing that, following on to what Administrator Bridenstine just said about the data, most of the data comes from the Air Force. Most of the data comes from the Department of Defense. We'll ship that into multiple places, though, and people can use that data to produce better products. And I think that if we do it right, we'll get benefit out of that in the Department of Defense, because the folks that do that business will learn from others doing it as well, and we'll apply the best practices in the business that we have to do in the military.
Okay, thank you. Oh, and I see that the clock is working now. So I guess I better hurry. Administrator Bridenstine, and we've touched on this already with other questions previously, but do you believe that utilization of best-of-breed commercial SSA processing software for enhanced foundational SSA for NASA to avoid a potential catastrophic debris collision with the International Space Station is the best way to go, or where should that software come from?
That's a great question. The answer is to the extent, and of course this is in the future, we're not there yet, but to the extent that we have a regime to do space situational awareness and space traffic management that is outside the Department of Defense and instead in a civil entity, there are different ways it could be organized. And of course, one of the ways that it could be organized is that it could be done by commercial providers of space situational awareness, that in fact some of which exist right now today. The Space Data Association, for example, the ComSpoc, and there are other companies providing data that feed the ComSpoc and the Space Data Association. So these are all technologies and capabilities that can be done commercially, can be done privately. The question is, going back to what General Hyten was talking about earlier, is who controls, who manages the data set, the catalog that is definitive, and ultimately, can it be enhanced with commercial and those kind of things? One model, as I've said earlier, is you could have multiple commercial companies and or nonprofits or universities competing to provide SSA and STM to space operators. And the reason you want competition is because it drives down price, it increases innovation. Again, you get better data and more data. That's a model that works. And then ultimately the people that pay for the data, that pay for the subscription, would be the operators. It is also true that we have to balance this with the idea that we don't want to drive people to other countries for their space situational awareness and space traffic management by having people in the United States pay for a subscription or pay for fees. So this is a balancing act. We want the United States of America to be preeminent when it comes to SSA, STM, and at the same time, we want to have commercial capabilities that give us more data, better data, and a competitive environment to drive down cost and increase innovation. So it's very early in the process. It's something we really need to think through, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
Okay, thank you. And I was going to ask you, Secretary Ross, the same question in just a few remaining seconds. Do you want to address that? And then I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Well, I agree very much with what the administrator has just said. There are alternate models that could be used, but at the end of the day, somebody in government needs either to do it or to license the private sector to do it. So either model in concept could work, but you still need a government interface. I don't think it's an activity that should just be left unbridled to the private sector, and I think everybody up here will agree with that.
I agree with that, Mr. Secretary.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, for coming together to have this discussion, and it's good to see a member of HASC as the administrator of NASA. Certainly, the questions that I want to follow up on are ones that we've all been walking around. When we talk about the assets of collection, whether ground-based or space-based, who ultimately will be the decider of those assets? Who's going to purchase them? Who's going to look into them? And when that decision is made, I would assume most of these things are going to have to go through the Department of Defense first to say what is sensitive nature, what and who decides, who makes that decision, whether or not this information gets released to the commercial side. So A, the assets, who's going to make the ultimate investments, and I've heard you talk about the commercial side, but ultimately we don't want duplication, but it all goes to the filter of the Department of Defense. So ultimately, who makes that decision on what information gets derived to the commercial side and who pays for the assets? If we could start with General Hyten.
I'll start, Congressman. So I believe that if you look at it as a building block of capabilities, I think the baseline capabilities is in the Department of Defense, and the Department of Defense will have to pay for that baseline. That baseline is what we need in order to understand what our adversaries are doing in space.
That's the highest and number one priority.
That is the number one priority. And so we then the bill for that comes to the Department of Defense. We have to pay for the sensors, we have to pay for the ground sensors, the space sensors, and the processing that allows us to do that. Now that's the baseline. But it doesn't talk about the interface with the commercial sector. It doesn't talk about the interface with others. We've been making that up. I mean, literally making it up for 9 years now. We need to have a structured process, and that's where the commercial sector can come in. That's where the Department of Commerce can come in, and they can look at a different way of doing business. They can bring in other sources of information, other display tools, other capabilities that can do that. They may decide that there are other sources from the international community that they can bring in. I would hope that we have a partnership where if they bring other sources, they'll feed that into our algorithm so we can take advantage of that too. We'll have to work through those issues, but I see there's a baseline building block that the Department of Defense is responsible for, and then NASA, Commerce, the commercial sector can build on top of that for other applications and other needs.
Well, would you ultimately have veto power if there's a piece of information that is coming from the Commerce side over to you that you see?
Mr. Norcross, is your microphone on?
Yeah. Hello.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah, usually can be heard.
So
do you ultimately have veto power on what information gets released?
So I think veto power is maybe too strong a statement. We're not going to have veto power, but this is the way it would work from a Department of Defense perspective. The algorithm that we use that processes all of this information that comes in, it's exquisite information, and we're going to take commercial, international. We'll take all the information that we get, but believe it or not, some of it is better than others. Some data is better than other data, and the algorithms will be able to tell. And so, if the data that we get from whatever source is deemed not as good and not providing the most accurate answer, we won't use that data in our solution set. That's why it comes back to the authoritative catalog as the key. The authoritative catalog will take all the best data and information, but at this point in time, from my perspective, all data is good, and then we'll mathematically decide what is the best data.
And then on the commercial side is where you would make those decisions?
So there could be capabilities where somebody who has maybe a commercial radar or a commercial telescope that is creating their own data, that they could actually get data that the Commerce Department might not have. Or they could get data that even the DoD might not have. And then they could share that data with either or both. So we don't want to limit the idea that only the government can do it. We need to have partners that can share. One of the challenges sometimes is that when you think about international data, they might not want to give it to Strategic Command. They might be willing to share data with Commerce. So that's a reason. Another reason we need a civil authority doing this rather than simply the Department of Defense. It's a lot like NASA, as a matter of fact. A lot of countries around the world don't want to partner with the United States Air Force, but they love to partner with NASA because we are a separate space agency capable of doing science and technology apart from any kind of military capability. So
this is where you would allow the private sector who is doing this also in through those doors.
Absolutely. And a lot of that private sector might be more than happy to share the data with the Department of Defense or others, and in fact they already do in many cases.
Well, that's why I say I hope they would share, but I can't guarantee that.
I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And this is very gratifying. We have an administration that is clearly committed to focus on space and what we can utilize space for and what the dangers are and what the potential profit and benefit is. And especially that when we have a Secretary of Commerce personally engaged, this has got to give a whole new energy to America's space efforts. And I'm very proud of each and every one of you and proud of our President for also stepping forward in this way. I believe that we have reached a tipping point in space beside what I just described, and that is we have now reached a time in space where we have capabilities of doing so much more than what we're doing today, and the private sector has the possibility of doing so much more because of our technological capabilities. But at the same time, we've reached a tipping point where space debris may get in the way of us achieving that goal. So this is the first step that I've seen, that we are taking space debris seriously, and that will open the door for some of these other great potentials that we have. We have whole constellations in the private sector being proposed for remote sensing and observation that could be very profitable businesses. But we know that unless we come to grips with this space debris challenge, they will not be going up. Let me ask you this, and I appreciate the fact that we're now talking mainly about cataloging and bringing in even the private sector for helping us catalog the problem and make sure we know what the problem and defining what it is. But have we given any thought to actually having the private sector, once it's cataloged, doing something about it, meaning actually having the private sector help us in extracting and taking some of the space debris, bringing it down? Just like to ask that to the panel.
Congressman, the answer is absolutely yes. Of course, NASA is very involved in making investments right now to do robotic servicing of satellites in orbit, which would be an absolute game changer. And when you think about the constellations that are going into low Earth orbit for communications, we're talking about thousands and thousands of satellites. What we don't want is each one of those satellites, when they become defunct, we don't want them just becoming a piece of space junk, right? We need to be able to either A, service them, or B, deorbit them. And I think there are good plans underway for that. But to the extent that NASA is making these investments in robotics, it's not just for servicing. It could ultimately be for that, the kind of activity you're talking about, which would be remediation, getting objects out of space. But that has to become, as you mentioned, you want it done commercially. I think that would be beneficial to everybody. The way it becomes available commercially is ultimately to do robotics for servicing of satellites, have half a dozen, maybe even a dozen different companies, each with their own constellations of a dozen or more satellites, doing robotic servicing. Once they're in orbit doing this activity commercially, because again, they're doing it to serve customers that are providing, DirecTV, Dish Network, internet broadband from space. They're doing it for those purposes. Well, then while they're there, they can also do some remediation, and the United States government could actually pay for that service. So this is an architecture that needs to be developed. NASA is making investments like I said, in the robotics. We're making investments in rendezvous and proximity operations, autonomy, propulsion capabilities that can have a specific impulse that can keep us, our satellites active for a very long period of time. Navigation, of course, the sensing that's necessary to do ultimately the approaches and rendezvous and proximity. So we are absolutely right now making investments in that activity. When it's going to be sufficiently mature to move out on what I think you're hoping that we can do, I don't have an answer for that at this time, but certainly
all of you are laying the foundation towards the next step, and without this taking care of this challenge, we will impede all the other great things that humankind is capable of. So thank you all, and Secretary Ross, especially thank you. And the General's out protecting our country in so many ways, and this is part of it. And Secretary Ross, you're the guy who's going to oversee commerce in the United States, and you know that this industry, the aerospace industry, is a tremendous asset to our country, and we're relying on you to, and as you're showing today, take leadership in keeping that a major part of our economy.
Thank you, sir.
All right, God bless.
Gentleman, yield back.
Yeah. My time was up anyway.
All right.
So
the chair now recognizes Mr. Pullman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, thank you for your testimony today. I just want to sort of get back to some basics just so I understand the terminology here, because we're talking about space situational awareness, which seems kind of wonky, and traffic management. So, General, from your testimony, I understand you, the Air Force, Department of Defense, would be in effect in charge of the space situational awareness with your monitoring capacity. Is that right?
The space situational awareness is a mission for the Department of Defense, and we will continue to do that mission. But it's interesting when you relate it to space traffic management, because the reason we started doing the space situational awareness mission, it was the foundation of the space control mission when I started this business 30-something years ago. We did it for space control, but when we started attaching space traffic management to it, we started thinking the catalog was actually to enable space traffic management. That's not why we do SSA. We do SSA to help defend ourselves against threats. And by having somebody else responsible for the space traffic management picture, Department of Commerce in this case, that will allow us to get back to using our SSA mission to focus on our space control mission, which is the essential piece, and somebody else will be doing the space traffic management. It's not that we don't have a role to play. We do, but that's not our focus.
But that's your main role is to just catalog and gather all of this information, which then you will share with NASA and with the Department of Commerce and other important agencies,
yes,
intelligence
sir.
Agencies, whatever they may be.
Exactly.
So, Mr. Secretary, let me turn my questioning to you. So, under this approach that's come out of the Space Council and from the administration, Commerce is in charge of traffic management. And so that is a concept that's not so hard for me to understand, because I just think about, okay, who's the law enforcement? You know, who gives the tickets? You know, who tows the abandoned vehicle? Who plows the road? You know, how do these kinds of things occur? And some of it's going to be commercial, and some of it will be regulatory. I mean, is that how you look at this?
Yes, I do. And as you're probably aware, we already have very extensive collaboration and cooperation with Department of Defense in our export control activities, because those interface both with national defense and with our job as being the ones to find people who are violating sanctions on countries or who are planning to export militarily sensitive materials. So we have a pretty well-established vocabulary of how to deal between Department of Defense and ourselves, then this will just be another addition to that. And I agree with what the General said. One size doesn't fit all. There are going to have to be adjustments as we go along, and the technologies will evolve, new space ventures will evolve. You're going to get into lunar habitation, You may very well get into asteroid mining, all kinds of activities.
So I'm comfortable with, I mean, somebody in this hierarchy's got to take the lead on if there is a collision, you know, whose insurance pays for it.
Right.
You know, that kind of thing. And Mr. Administrator, you and I have had this conversation several times. What are your thoughts? Just sort of the basics of this.
A few things. As a pilot, if somebody says to you on the radio, call sign, turn right 030, descend, maintain 10,000 feet, you do it. Why? Because if you don't, it's illegal and you could possibly die. So that's why you do it. Right now in space, nobody has authority to compel you to maneuver. They can tell you the Department of Defense, the Strategic Command can tell you it's a good idea, but they can't tell you to do it. So that's the difference between space situational awareness and ultimately space traffic management. One of the challenges with space traffic management is if you compel somebody to maneuver, you could be burning 4 months of their station-keeping fuel just to prevent them from having a collision. And the best we can do these days in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, the best we could do is, you know, there's 1 in 10,000 chances that your satellite will collide with another satellite. And are you going to burn 4 months worth of station-keeping fuel and give up 4 months worth of potential revenue as a company in order to avoid a 1 in 10,000 chance? Now, the answer is you're probably not. But when you think about the catastrophic consequences of not maneuvering, should that 1 in 10,000 chance occur, you can deny access to space or at least make it more problematic for, you know, generations to come. So this is a big deal. There has to be some agency that is capable of doing that. Again, I want to be clear, because this makes a lot of space operators nervous. We want an absolute minimal regulatory burden with maximum regulatory certainty and safety.
But there has to be some kind of management, and I agree with that, and I yield back to the chair.
Thank you, gentlemen. Chair now recognizes Mr. Brooks for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Forgive me for diverging from the primary focus of this hearing, but it occurs to me that each of you has significant persuasive influence on where the new Space Command will be headquartered, so I'm going to touch on that just for a moment. In that vein, I hope you will help make Redstone Arsenal a finalist in the Space Command headquarters debate. Redstone Arsenal has a lot to offer. We have related to Space Command, either related a lot or related a little, the following Space Command activities. United States Army Aviation and Missile Command, Aviation and Missile Research, Development and Engineering Center, PEO Missiles and Space, United States Army Space and Missile Command, Army Forces Strategic Command, United States Missile Defense Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency Missile and Space Intelligence Center, NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, which is the home and birthplace of America's space program, a wealth of intellectual talent, engineers. We have the highest concentration of engineers in the United States of America, physicists, mathematicians, scientists. In conclusion, I hope you will concur that Redstone Arsenal and the Space Command seem like an excellent fit. Now, with that sales pitch behind me, let's go more to the substance of this particular hearing. I do appreciate your indulgence, and I know y'all all have persuasive influence on the ultimate outcome of that Space Command location debate. I know that the Department of Defense has done some interim work with the Federal Aviation Administration on SSA. With respect to Jim Bridenstine's Space Renaissance Act from last Congress that put the one-stop shop for commercial space at the Department of Transportation, not the Department of Commerce, what would be your insight on your perspective on where we're looking at now?
A great question. As you just recognized, I have in the past sponsored legislation, authored legislation to have the one-stop shop be at FAA AST, especially taking AST and moving it out of the FAA and making it a direct report to the Department of Transportation, specifically to the Secretary. So that was legislation that I ran a couple of years ago to really force the conversation about this kind of activity and how important it is. Now, I'll also tell you, as a member of the Science Committee, Space Subcommittee specifically, I have voted multiple times on the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act, which puts this at commerce. So my views on this, of course, have shifted, but I think more importantly than anything else, it has to be done. And it doesn't, to me, it doesn't matter so much where, just the fact that we don't have time to waste anymore. And if we get caught in whether it's a parochial issue or a jurisdictional issue among committees, we get this, and this thing gets held up for a year or two, we're at risk, especially when you consider the large constellations that are going to be put into low Earth orbit. I think Secretary Ross has made a compelling argument for why it should be commerce. I fully support that, and I'm ready to move out on it.
General Hyten, question for you, but first a comment. It's always good to see someone with the success that you've enjoyed from my hometown, Huntsville, Alabama. So anytime you get a chance to come back, we've got over 100 generals who have retired there. I'm sure you'd be welcome too when that time comes.
Are you trying to retire me, Congressman?
This question is for you. What is your assessment today of the Department of Commerce's ability to manage these authorities, and do they have the proper resources and personnel needed to manage these authorities? And if not, what is your opinion on what is needed to get them there?
So I guess if it's a yes-no question, which you just asked, then the answer is no, they don't have all the things they need to do. But Secretary Ross realizes that, and he has committed inside the National Space Council, he's committed to me at breakfast this morning that he's going to identify the right people if he has to go down this path and put those people at this job. His folks have been unbelievably transparent and helpful in defining what this space traffic management piece would be in the Department of Commerce. They've been straightforward. So he does not have all the issues he has or he'll need to do that job in the future. But he is committed to making sure that he identifies those and pursues those. I'm sure he'll be working with you on that issue in the future.
Well, with respect to Secretary Ross and General Hyten and, of course, Jim Bridenstine, I happen to serve on I'm vice chair of the Space Subcommittee of SST, and I'm also on the Strategic Forces Committee of House Armed Services Committee. So if there's anything I can do to help ensure that the Department of Commerce has the resources it needs, please let me know in wearing one hat or the other. Mr. Chairman, yield back the remainder of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize Mr. Lamb for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bridenstine, first question for you. You mentioned a couple times that you thought that if we took the lead on SSA in the United States and developed a better system through the Department of Commerce and worked with private enterprise, that would actually give the United States a competitive advantage when it came to firms actually opening their businesses and putting their capital here in the future. Would you mind elaborating on exactly how that would work? Because I'm just sort of picturing if what we're doing is really making data available, why would that actually give firms an incentive to locate in the United States, or how could we make sure that it does, I guess?
Great question. So the idea is we have companies that are international investing, in many cases, billions of dollars into constellations that will be in low Earth orbit. And those companies are going to be looking for opportunities to protect their investments. How safe of a regime are they going to have? And certainly, they're going to want access to, what the United States has to offer. Now, it is absolutely true that given the current regime that exists right now, the Department of Defense, through STRATCOM, ultimately provides space situational awareness and conjunction analysis to the entire world, and they do it for free. And they do it for free because we have to protect the space domain. I mean, if you look historically, the Department of Defense got into this business because they were trying to protect American national security interests. Well, it's still in America's national security interest to prevent collisions and more orbital debris in space. But I do believe that if the United States of America has a regime that could be commercial and it could be led by a civilian agency, that a lot of companies all over the world are going to want to establish American companies to get the absolute best data for the protection of their billion-dollar investments or $100 million investments, big investments. And that, I think, is good for America. It grows the economy. It helps our balance of payments and our trade deficit. And I think that that's a big piece of what we ought to be doing. It also could lower insurance premiums if they have access to that data. So
does that place the onus on us then to make sure that any data sharing from the civilian agency with private firms would be dependent on that private firm having an American presence, essentially?
So there's different levels. We talked about having basic SSA data that would be necessary for safety in general. And then there's data that could be made available from commercial operators that would provide an enhanced level of protection, if you will. And so finding that right balance, I think, is important because we want to have a competitive market where we're trying to get more data and better data. But as everybody here has agreed, it is inherently governmental because ultimately it's in everybody's interest to protect space. So we have to have that civil agency that's responsible for it ultimately.
Thank you. General Hyten, I just wanted to follow up on a point in your testimony about our adversaries, other countries, even some of our allies making increasing investments in space at the same time. Can you talk about any of those, to the extent you're able here, that should concern us or that make the space more competitive than we might realize, investments being made by other countries?
So both China and Russia have invested enormous amounts of their national treasure to build capabilities for the sole purpose of counting the United States' advantage in space. They've built ground-based capabilities, space-based capabilities, a variety of different technologies that I can't go into in this hearing, but enormous amounts of their treasure going with the sole purpose. It's not for something going on in the Western Pacific. It's nothing for going on. It's the sole purpose is to counter the United States' advantage in space. And as the commander responsible for defending the nation in that domain, I have to look at those capabilities as real threats. And that means I have to develop counters to those threats, which is why the first thing I have to have, just like in any other domain, is exquisite situational awareness of what is happening in that domain so I can respond quickly enough. That's the same in air, land, sea. It's the same in space.
Are they spending more than us in any of these domains, General, or just more than they have in the past?
I can't go into specifics, but in certain areas, they are investing more than we are. We're still, our capabilities are so huge, enormous, powerful, that the capabilities they have really can't impact us today. But what we have to make sure is that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, that is still the same. That is the challenge.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. At this point, we're going to pause for a minute. While we very much appreciate the Secretary Ross and his participation in this hearing, and it's been very helpful, he has been called to the White House, so we're going to excuse the Secretary and take any further questions for him for the record and allow him 10 days to provide a written response to the member who has a question. And with that, thank you, Mr. Ross, and you're excused.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your service to your country. Administrator Bridenstine, you display a tremendous amount of common sense, which makes it very clear why you're no longer in Congress. You gentlemen have provided excellent testimony in a very fascinating time in the history of mankind, where space has clearly become a theater of engagement militarily, while at the same time is a new frontier for a tremendous expansion of commercial activity. We have models like this, of course, throughout the history of man. There's never been a theater of engagement that did not include civilian commercial activity, be it by land, sea, or air. So the models of the past, as they help us to plan for the future, I believe we're on the right track here, because the DOD needs to handle defense and warfare capabilities in any theater of engagement, and to divest itself. Now, it's understandable why over the last several decades, DOD has become deeply involved. It's obvious that cataloging the activities in space, because of the responsibility of recognizing space as a theater of engagement, it's understandable why this has happened and got to this point where DOD is doing a tremendous amount of activity that pulls it away from warfare capabilities. And it makes sense that at this juncture, we would divest some of those responsibilities to the appropriate agency. So with respect to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I believe what we endeavor to determine with absolute certainty is which civilian agency is appropriate to relieve that burden from DOD. So it's been suggested, and I'm leaning yes to concur, that the Department of Commerce is that agency. So, General, is this a good idea? Is this a win for America and for the defense of our nation?
So, Congressman, this is actually a great day. Probably should have said that early on, because this is a day that we have been looking for a long time. Because we decided, we've had interesting dynamics. The first time you see a collision between a piece of debris and a Chinese satellite, what are you supposed to do? Well, I remember that conversation and the commander saying, tell them, we don't want a collision to happen, but how is that a Department of Defense mission? And so we started a long time ago trying to figure out, how do we do this differently? That shouldn't be the responsibility of the Department of Defense. We shouldn't be forcing our airmen, soldiers, sailors, Marine to make those kind of decisions. That is clearly other elements of our government. So we've gone back and forth where it needs to be. The administration has decided Commerce is the place. Secretary Ross has jumped in and said, I'm the guy, let's go ahead and do that. I'm all in with that. I'm all in. I think that's the right decision. We just ought to go. Our Administrator Bridenstine said the same thing a while ago. We gotta just go now. It is the time. We can't waste any more time.
I concur. Administrator, would you comment on that question, please?
Here's what I'd like to share. I think it's an important philosophical debate, but when you look at the expansion of humanity, whether humanity is crossing the Atlantic or crossing the continent from east to west, or expanding into space, if you will, it's all driven by commerce. And philosophically, if we're going to go further, it's going to be driven by commerce. And the resources that are available in space are, quite frankly, they're limitless. And so commerce, I think, should take the helm here for that basic philosophical reason. The other thing that's important to note is that space has transformed all of our lives, and we are now dependent on space in ways we've never. A lot of Americans don't recognize how dependent we are on space, the way we navigate, the way we communicate, the way we produce food, the way we produce energy, how we do disaster relief, predict weather, monitor the climate, the way we do national security and defense. All of it depends on space. In fact, the GPS signal is required for banking. If we lose the GPS signal, that changes. In fact, it could be catastrophic for our country. You lose the GPS signal, you can't do banking. Next thing you know, there's no milk in the grocery store, civil unrest. It's a huge challenge. So here's the important thing, going back in time, when you think about the history of naval power, for example, Alfred Thayer Mahan, he was a great theorist on naval power. Commerce ultimately results in that commerce being threatened. And that's what's happening right now. Our entire way of life is dependent on space. And our, not enemies necessarily, but our competitors know that, and they're developing capabilities to thwart our way of life. And so if commerce is important for the power of nations, as Alfred Thayer Mahan said back in the 1800s, then defending that commerce is also important as well, or protecting that commerce, which is, again, why I believe it is perfectly legitimate and good that commerce take the helm of providing space situational awareness and space traffic management.
Gentlemen, you present a compelling argument. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And in response to your invitation, I have a question for Secretary Ross that I will submit, basically noting my curiosity about, as we transition to this new plan, since I don't see anything in the FY 18 and 19 budgets to help the Department of Commerce finance that, how they plan on addressing it. But I'll submit that in writing. If I could turn now to my fellow Oklahoman, the administrator, Mr. Bridenstine. First off, I've promised your constituents I will provide the most intense oversight of your life for the rest of your career in that role, which will be an awesome experience, just taking care of my fellow Oklahomans' concerns. Let's talk for a moment, though, in general, if you would, since this summer is the 60th anniversary of the legislation that created your agency, when the Eisenhower administration and our predecessors in Congress determined that we needed to have a civilian perspective on space exploration. As we talk today about what Commerce is going to do and the continued important mission of the Department of Defense, where do you envision NASA actually playing as these issues evolve over the coming decades?
So NASA is an agency. We do discovery and exploration. We do science. And of course, we're not involved in national security space. We're not involved in defense. But certainly, we want to make sure that our assets are secure. And that's when you think about space situational awareness, space traffic management, and the fact that we have humans in orbit right now. We have to be very aware of the space environment and the risks that it poses to our astronauts. So I like how you framed it, Chairman Lucas, that in 1958, Eisenhower created NASA. He did it with an expressed intent that space exploration not be part of the Department of Defense. He wanted it intentionally separate. He wanted a peaceful agency that could partner with the rest of the world in making civilization-changing discoveries. That was his objective. And what I would say now is we don't necessarily want space situational awareness and space traffic management to be a Department of Defense specific issue. Certainly they're going to do that, but they don't have to do the conjunction analysis and warning for the entire world for free, and not to mention all of the commercial operators as well. So I think it's important to have a civil agency capable of doing that, just like Eisenhower envisioned for NASA back in 1958.
General, some 30-plus years ago, I had a conversation at a public event with a colonel who was an officer in, I believe, what is probably your organization now, 30 years back. And as a non-public official, I spent a little bit of time asking him a variety of questions, being inquisitive. And he was one of the most cautious, methodical, thorough officers I've seen. He said absolutely nothing. But I finally asked him a question, and I'll ask you a question, the same question I asked him. How do you sleep at night? 30-some years ago, he said, I sleep very well at night. How do you sleep at night with your responsibilities?
I sleep very well.
Thank you for the answer I wanted. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
One comment on that. It's important. The reason I sleep well is I mentioned in my opening statement, because I have 162,000 of the best and brightest that America has to offer that do the job every day. And they actually do the work. I don't do any of the work. They do the work. And because they're out there, deployed under the ground, under the sea, in the air, operating in space, that should allow you to sleep well because it allows me to sleep well.
And that's the exact point I wanted you to make, General, because the general public does not have an understanding or an appreciation for all of that. And for 30-plus years, this important role has been fulfilled. Again, thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Hyten, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just say to the Administrator, welcome back. We are honored that you are in the role you're in. We'll miss you here, but you are the right person for this position at this time, and we are honored deeply that you are in that role. And welcome back here today. General, let me begin with you. Just in light of all the conversation today, how do you prioritize the competing interests and needs between DOD, commercial, and SSA requirements?
So it goes back to the discussion of the building block. So the building block, the essential building block from my perspective is our national security. And so that's the first thing that I have to worry about. Do we have enough information, enough situational awareness to allow me to exercise the authorities and responsibilities that have been given to me for the mission of Strategic Command and defend our nation in space? That is the first priority. That is the priority that the United States Department of Defense has to pay for, has to understand, et cetera. We have chosen over the last 9 years since the Iridium-Cosmos collision to pay for kind of the rest of the world, both with resources and manpower and money to provide that kind of collision warning, situational awareness for the world, because we realized after the Iridium-Cosmos collision in 2009, if a collision occurs, it is really bad for the security of America and for the security of the world. So nobody was doing it, so we said we can do it, so we did. But ever since that time, we've been looking for the structure that will allow us to just focus on our national security mission and have somebody else do that. Somebody else also pay the resources for that additional function. Not above the baseline. We still have to continue to do the baseline, but all those other pieces are from that. Now, the Space Policy Directive 3 designates the Department of Commerce as the person to step up and do that, and Secretary Ross has said he's the guy, he's going to step up and do that, and that's what we in the Department of Defense have been looking for a number of years. So we're happy with where we are right now.
So are you saying then Department of Defense would be the top priority, followed by SSA, then commercial? Is that kind of?
Well, from an SSA perspective, not from a space traffic management perspective.
Okay.
Space traffic management should be somebody else's job. But we have to focus on what we need from space situational awareness in order to allow us to defend ourselves in space and defend ourselves against any adversary that might challenge us in space. That means exquisite situational awareness. It just so happens that that information is what is also needed for space traffic management. But we'll give that data to somebody else to process, to do the analysis, to reach out to nations, to reach out to companies. We've been doing that, and we've been making it up. And I'm pretty proud of the folks that have been making it up, because it's a miracle to me we haven't had a collision. But that should be somebody else's job.
Well, then, in light of that, how much manpower and resources and so forth do you use when dedicating efforts to negotiate SSA agreements with commercial foreign states and so forth?
So for negotiating SSA agreements, it's been very small.
Okay.
It's four or five people on my staff that do that work, and that's not their only job. They have other jobs that they do as well, but that's one of their additional duties, is to focus on that.
Okay.
The biggest impact, though, is the people that actually have to do the work, the processing. That number is in dozens. That's what will be offloaded to significant numbers that will free them up to do what I believe is the real warfighting missions.
Okay. So in freeing that up, you would be able to better utilize it for defense purposes.
Exactly.
Mr. Administrator, I heard you bring up earlier, and let me just ask you this: how will the trend that is currently underway for small satellites affect SSA capabilities and beyond?
That's another great question. So every orbital regime is different. Of course, we have a lot of assets in low Earth orbit. We have a lot of assets in geostationary orbit. Those are two orbits that are critically important, and they'll require a space situational awareness and space traffic management regime that's very different than a medium Earth orbit or an orbit that's below low Earth orbit. Sometimes I've heard people make the argument that CubeSats ought to be below the International Space Station in order to not necessarily be regulated at all with STM or SSA, that if you're below the ISS, you're going to be deorbiting just based on the trace atmosphere at that level within 5 to 10 years anyway, so we don't really need a regime. So what I would say is it's not necessarily the size of the satellite that matters, but what matters is where that satellite is positioned, and the different orbital regimes are going to have different kind of requirements for where they're located.
Okay. Again, thank you both, gentlemen, for all you do. We're honored. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Mitchell for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, Administrator Bridenstine, I want to congratulate you on your becoming the administrator, and thank you. As your departing the committee gave you the opportunity to join the committee. So congratulations, and I'm warming your chair, I guess.
You are indeed. Thank you for doing that.
It's an honor, sir. Question, if you could relate to also Mr. Ross, and we'll submit for the committee. you would advocate as well that these situational awareness or traffic management go to the FAA. And the FAA is currently involved in that they certify launches, aircraft that are launched, they provide certification for that in this process. Can you share with me how much involvement the FAA has been involved in this process as this transition is going on? And I'll ask the same question of Secretary Ross as well.
So I don't, I'll be honest, I've been in Congress until about 7 or 8 weeks ago. So I wasn't part of all the negotiations that got to the point where we were ready to announce SPD 3. So I do know that FAA was involved. There were meetings in the National Space Council where this discussion was had. How robust it was and who said what and when, I'm not 100% sure. But I can tell you that everybody is in agreement that I've talked to that this has to be done in a civil agency.
Agreed.
Commerce is a good place to do it. It's also important to note, as Secretary Ross noted, that commerce is involved in space in a robust way already. A lot of people don't realize the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, about 40% of their budget is space-related activities. And of course, that's controlled by commerce, and ultimately they make purchases for those activities, and NASA's involved in buying a lot of their satellites, or at least doing a lot of the requirements generation and then the activities that are necessary to acquire those satellites. So NASA is involved in that. But it's a commerce function. It's also important to note that commerce is involved in remote sensing, licensing, and that kind of activity. So there's a lot of activities that are done both in commerce and the FAA. A couple of years ago, when I drafted that bill, my thought was we'll put it at FAA and we'll take everything and put it at FAA. It appears now that the right course of action, given the consensus that has been come to, is that it be at commerce, and I fully support that. The key is it needs to be done. That needs to happen.
I agree. It does need to be done. One of the questions I have, as you well know, is space and commercial FAA-type traffic isn't a clean division. There's clearly, and I've talked with some of the folks involved with SpaceX and others, there's an overlap of that. How do you reconcile, and maybe, General, you have some feedback, how do you reconcile that or make that work?
I'll take it real quick. There are a lot of seams here that are critically important. As you mentioned, if you're going to get to space, you're going to have to go through the National Airspace System, number one. Then when you get to space, eventually you're going to have to potentially deorbit if you're in low Earth orbit.
Sure.
And so in each of these cases, you're going to be taking advantage of the National Airspace System. One of the challenges that we have right now is when a launch occurs, the National Airspace System for a geographic region gets shut down for a number of hours, and commercial air traffic has to go around it, and it costs a lot of money and puts a big burden on industry. We want that to shrink. So whether it's launch or a whole host of other activities, commerce is going to have to work with FAA and vice versa. And so these seams have to be really well thought out, and we need to prepare for them. But that's going to happen regardless of where it is. Commerce and FAA are going to have to work together to make it happen.
Agreed. My concern was that I admit I sit on TAI and I'm on the Aviation Subcommittee, so I look at it. I didn't see here, and I would encourage some description of how actively you engage with the FAA on this, because I think there is not just launch, but in fact, failure of a launch, that area needs to be closed. All the risks and factors affect that civil aviation, that airspace now.
Yeah.
General, do you have anything you wish to add to that, sir?
So I agree with the administrator. The key there is, when it comes to space, every element of the government is involved. Some in big ways, some in small ways, which means there's always going to be seams. So the way you handle seams is with clear authorities and responsibilities. And the authority to the Secretary of Defense is to defend the nation. The authority to commerce to promote commerce. Now you have to decide, for this space traffic management, where is the best place to put the authority? The administration decided the Department of Commerce is the best place to put that. But that doesn't mean that the FAA still has a role, Department of Defense still has a role, NASA still has a role. We all are going to have roles as we go through this, but we have to align under some, because if you don't, we'll just keep doing it.
I appreciate that, and I would suggest that maybe a little more clarity, and if you, I'll share with Secretary Ross as well in terms of what those seams are and that role of the FAA, so that we don't end up losing something there, I think would be critically important. I appreciate your answers, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize Mr. Byer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Administrator, thanks so much for being with us all morning. Administrator Bridenstine, I'm very impressed with the many things NASA is doing in this space. The new space fence, radar, the NASA orbital debris engineering model, which predicts what's coming in the next 30 to 35 years, the LEO to GEO environment debris model, LEGEND, which looks at what the environment's going to be like in 100 to 200 years. Can you tell us what LEGEND tells us about this 100 to 200 year? Is space going to become ever more crowded and ever more dangerous?
Absolutely. So just to be clear, Space Fence is not a NASA project. It's a DoD project.
Okay.
But we certainly will benefit from it. I am a little concerned that we're going to learn about so much space debris that our astronauts are going to be sheltering in place a lot more than they are right now. In fact, we haven't sheltered in place since 2015. Once we have more situational awareness on all the debris that's out there, it could you know, once you know what you need to be worried about, you get more worried about it. So there is a concern there on my end.
Mr. Minister, let me ask you the most naive question of the morning. Is there anything we can do to collect the debris that's out there?
There are certain technologies that are being developed. NASA, of course, is involved in robotic servicing of satellites. It's a project we have right now underway that is called Restore-L, and we're going to service a Landsat 7 satellite, which is a good project. But ultimately, if we want to do robotic servicing in a way that is beneficial to our country and game-changing, we need to develop robotic technologies that can then be licensed to a dozen companies, and each of those companies could have a dozen satellites in low Earth orbit doing robotic servicing of satellites. When we get to that position, it is absolutely possible that we could hire some of those commercial companies to remove orbital debris. So that's certainly within the realm of possibility and a futuristic kind of thought, a futuristic kind of thinking about how to deal with the orbital debris population.
And it was certainly, if you look at that 30 to 35 years, or 100 to 200 years, I'm working on the assumption that mankind is going to put ever more debris up there year after year.
That's true. It is also true that the biggest risk to emissions in low Earth orbit, the biggest risk is from objects that are too small to even track. Yeah. So we can kind of create a statistical model as to what the environment looks like and create probabilities about how long a satellite can last in low Earth orbit given the pelting that it's going to receive from debris and how much shielding it might need to have. So we can create those statistical models, but ultimately the biggest risk is from objects that we can't even track right now. So it's going to be hard to remove them if we don't know that they're there specifically.
Mr. Minister, I know you have a hard science background with your triple major at Rice. Is there any value to the orbital degradation of this stuff, or is it just too small to have the orbits degrade in our lifetimes?
Oh, a lot of they do degrade, especially in low Earth orbit. There's trace atmosphere. The gravity of the Earth is not uniform, and so we see a lot of these objects behaving in ways that sometimes are unanticipated. I know Dr. Marie Bajah was here just a few minutes ago from the University of Texas. He talks about the fact that a lot of these objects in space that are not even trackable, or the objects that are trackable, they're not. We model them as if they are all perfect spheres, and they're not. Yeah. We model them as if they don't spin or maneuver, and they do. We model them as if the Earth's gravity is perfectly uniform, and it's not. So there's a lot we need to learn about orbital debris and how it behaves so that ultimately we can get better data to ultimately make predictions and characterizations that can protect our assets and property. But you're hitting some very key points, which are it is a dangerous environment. We need to do the best we can to characterize that environment, and ultimately we need to be able to detect objects that are smaller than 10 centimeters, which is what we can do right now.
Let me ask you a small but probably important budget question. In your testimony, you talked about the Conjunction Assessment Risk Analysis Office at Goddard, which I'm sure you're very proud of, and that they have, the primary role of checking the 65 spacecraft, et cetera, et cetera. And its budget's $4 million a year, and yet we know the rest of the things you're putting up there are billions of dollars. Are we spending enough money on the CARA office?
I think we are. Certainly, if more money is better, But given the risk that we're seeing to our missions and their ability to assess those risks and then make determinations for maneuvers as necessary, I believe we are in a good position right now with the investments that we have.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator. I yield back, Chair.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Dunn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Bridenstine, Jim, it's great to see you here. I have a couple of questions about the services currently provided. So the Space Policy Directive reaffirmed the basic collision avoidance information services are and should continue to be provided free of user fees. Can you confirm that that is so going forward?
That is a big objective, again, because it's important for the United States of America to be preeminent here in this capability. And we want companies to locate in the United States believing that they're going to have these kind of services available through a civil agency. So I believe that basic SSA is important for the safety of the space environment in general.
As do my constituents.
Okay, good.
And in that same vein, if the government contracts with a private company to provide space situational awareness functions, in that situation, will the data and the analytics continue to be available, and will the raw data be available in repository form so that civilian companies can perform their own analytics?
So that's a wonderful question. And not an easy one, but eventually the way I think it's going to go is there's going to be a basic SSA kind of capability that is available to everybody, and it will be without fee, which I think is important. But there are also going to be private companies that are going to want to give advantages to other private companies operating in space, and in order to provide that advantage, they're going to license their data to a private company, and the U.S. government might not have access to that. So that presents an opportunity for commercial companies to augment data and get better resolution, higher resolution, and really in a free market, you know, the United States government can't confiscate that data. So I think there's going to be an architecture that is going to have a basic SSA capability, and then there's also going to be commercial companies that can come alongside and provide that to operators, maybe in their model. Other people might want to develop sensors and data and sell it directly to the government. That might be a model as well.
So specifically, can you address the raw data that the government currently gathers? Would that raw data be available to private companies?
It would be available to the public. Any government data would be available to the public. And right now, that data generally comes from Stratcom through the JSPOC.
Let me ask you, maybe I should have asked the General that. He's holding that. But let me, what was the rationale for assigning the Department of Commerce, not NASA, as the lead civil agency for space situational awareness?
So NASA is an agency that does science and technology. We do discovery. We do exploration. What we don't do is regulate. That's historically.
I think that's good. I just wanted to get you on record.
Okay.
I think I actually agree with that decision. I just wanted to get it out. General Hyten, space is being designated as a warfighting domain as well as a commercial domain. Where do you see the trend in space control sort of evolving for DoD and space situational awareness?
So it's interesting because as the combatant commander with space as my joint operating area, I actually have two priorities, and some people think they conflict. Priority number one is to defend this nation against all threats. And that means I have to be able to watch any threat, deal with any threat, defeat any threat. And I do that. But I also have an implied task that says I have to make sure that the space environment is safe for the future, because anything bad that happens in space, it's not like, we were talking about cleaning up the environment a while ago. It's not like you can just go out right now and clean it up. You know, if you have a collision in space, the impacts are forever. So there is an implied task that I have to be able to operate safely in order to do that. That's why for the last 9 years we've stepped up to the job of providing that for the world. We will continue to do that until hopefully the Department of Commerce steps up in the near term to do that for us, because it's in our interest as a nation to have a secure space environment.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think you've done a great job. I hope you continue to have a great presence there. I was looking when I saw this Space Policy Directive number 3 came out. I saw 1 and 2, so I had a chance to go back and look at that. And you know, the SPD 1 was let's go to the Moon and Mars. SPD2 was let's streamline the space regulatory environment. And now I'm looking at that space SPD3, and I'm looking at all the things that address this. And my staff summed that up well for me. They said, just to make space great again. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize Mr. Foster for 5 minutes.
Thank you to our witnesses, and congratulations to Administrator Bridenstine.
Thank you.
Nice to have you back. I'd like, if you could speak a little bit about how you are viewing the international governance and enforcement of space commerce. You know, the United States is not alone. I think it's, you know, the rest of the world has roughly a comparable number of orbiting devices, and that ratio is going to change over time. And so do you anticipate a future where every country pretty much goes its own way and regulates its own commerce, and we have to worry about a race to the bottom for the lowest level of regulation, which will be the lowest cost for multinational corporations? Or do you anticipate that the U.S. regulator will serve underneath and be potentially overridden by an international body with regulation over all space activities?
That's a great question, Congressman. Currently, in some orbital regimes, the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, which is a part of the United Nations, does license orbital slots for the international community. And of course, American companies are involved in getting their orbital slots from the ITU. The ITU is also involved in allocating spectrum for commercial operators. So there is already an international component there. Maybe where at this point it's insufficient is what's happening largely in low Earth orbit, where there's a whole lot more debris and a whole lot more risk, I should say. And the answer is, right now there isn't that kind of international oversight in low Earth orbit the way there is in geostationary orbit. And what I would say is, what I think the direction we should go is we should set those standards. And NASA has a history of doing this.
Right, yeah, but there's the enforcement problem when someone goes to a country that is not setting those standards, puts stuff up in space. Who says no, and how is that enforced?
It's done through the ITU, which is
yeah. I mean, look at the South China Sea, right?
Right, right. No, that's right.
You know, an international body clearly spoke and said that is not an acceptable activity, and a certain country that will remain nameless sort of is ignoring that.
So,
when that recurs in space, what is the scenario here that you're thinking of?
So, as a pilot in the Navy, I used to operate in the Persian Gulf, and we would get challenged by various countries, and they would say, you're operating in the wrong part of the world or whatever, and we would always go back and say, under ICAO procedures, the International Civil Aviation Organization, that we were a sovereign U.S. aircraft operating in international airspace due regard. And that word due regard is ultimately what protects us from challenges from the international community. And I would argue that, you know, as it relates to us right now in space, we operate due regard. And I would say that as time goes on, American leadership might need to be a little stronger here so that ultimately we don't have collisions that beget more collisions.
Yeah, okay, but what happens when two countries start fighting over mining the same asteroid or things like that? You know, what is is there any alternative to an international governance organization? And if there is not, why are we not prioritizing that first to get that structure in place and get the U.S. regulators plugged into it?
I think the model that we utilize right now, and of course this is established through the Outer Space Treaty, where
many countries are not signatories to the Outer Space Treaty. They have not ratified it. Important countries, you know, like China, like others you could name.
Sure. So certainly that requires international pressure to get them to conform to the international standards.
But so is your concept here that U.S. regulation will be secondary to international regulation, or that we're just going to go make up our own rules?
I think we adhere to the treaties that are currently in place, specifically the Outer Space Treaty, and as long as we're operating under the obligations of our international treaties,
which are incomplete and there'll have to be detailed regulations. For example, if you look at cybersecurity, you can't have people put up swarms of satellites in ways without enough cybersecurity that ensures they can't be hacked and use their station keeping ability to go and knock out the ISS or any of these sort of scenarios. There will have to be international standards on, for example, cybersecurity for any satellite with station keeping ability. Okay, and there will be different countries will have different opinions on that. If some countries think that the U.S. standards are not high enough, and we say no, that's too expensive, how do you anticipate that decision will be handled?
So as far as your earlier suggestion that if we mine an asteroid and maybe somebody else wants to mine the same asteroid, and that could result in a dispute, I think the odds of that are exceptionally small. But I think also at the same time, we can operate due regard, and whoever extracts the resource has the rights to the resource under the Outer Space Treaty, which we are signatories to.
All right. Well, I guess my time is up here, but I think, I really urge you to think more about the international. The idea that America acting alone is a reasonable model to proceed is not going to work.
And, sir,
50 years from now, the majority of objects in orbit are not going to be U.S. objects, and we are not going to dominate space in the long term, and we should start planning for that and accept it rather than just pretending like the world is not changing.
I would argue that we are in compliance with our obligations under the Outer Space Treaty and other treaties, and that ultimately, we will.
Yeah, but we have to get all the countries on Earth to do this, or it's not going to be too meaningful. And that's the thing that worries me. And we have to start by strengthening those agreements and making them uniform. And I don't see a lot of effort on this administration in plugging into a strong international regulatory regime.
There isn't a strong international regulatory regime.
And that should be prioritized.
And so we need to have American leadership.
Gentleman yields back, and that brings us to the conclusion of this hearing. I did want to point out if we've had members having to come and go, so some members may have some questions they need to get to y'all, so we're going to leave the record open for 10 days if you could respond to those in writing. And also make note of something else. This is a very important area of interest, and that's demonstrated by the fact that we had 30 members of Congress participate in this joint subcommittee hearing today, many of whom weren't even on the two subcommittees. And combined with, if you went outside 2 hours before this hearing, the line started forming to get in here. That usually only happens when the chiefs are here or the secretary. People care about what you do, and we're very proud that we've got two competent individuals such as you serving in this in the roles that you have. So thank you for being here. It's been very helpful. This hearing is adjourned.